we are already talking more about connections than running that something. Simply because beyond a couple of apps or microservices, whatever we call them today, the complexity of managing all at once increases drastically.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 129, How to Develop Microservices. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Back in episode 123, we were talking about simplifying microservice development. And that came from a question that we had over in our Slack workspace from Stefan. And we're sort of revisiting that today and going to talk about some more concrete examples. So if you go back and listen to 123, if you haven't listened to it yet, go listen to it. But one of the short parts of it is okay, how do I manage microservice development in isolation from everybody else? And our answer was, well, and the joke was because Victor had just bought his new M1, and it's like, okay, it's got 16 gig of RAM. And my question to him was, well, you can run everything that runs inside of AWS and Google on that one machine, right? Because we don't need anything else. Because the M1 is, the savior of the world at this point. Not. But then Stefan actually followed up with this, is like the way he does his development, he does local development, and that's partially remote where the code is on his machine but executed in a remote compute. And then fully remote, code, IDE, compute is all remote. So there's 3 different thought processes here. So locally on the machine, we covered, I believe, pretty good in 1, 2, 3. I mean, we can retouch on it, but then let's talk about these 3 things. So locally, partially, and then fully remote.
All 3 of them. It really depends on what we're trying to do, right? If I have everything set up, and that's usually when the architecture and applications are homogeneous, meaning that, hey, we are all working with Java, we're all working with Go, and I already have everything installed, set up, it's probably more comfortable for me to do local development than anything else. And that assumes that I have small number of applications and they can run locally. And in small, I mean 1 or 2 or 3, right? Beyond that, I do not want to run them locally, even if they're all already ready to go, and even if it's, everything packaged in container images and relatively straightforward, and it can fit on my machine and all those things. I probably don't want to run 50 applications on my local Kubernetes cluster because why? Why would I do that, right? There are always complications of running more than a couple of something. That's actually, now when I think about it, almost the same, right? So let's say that I want to run an A application, maybe 2 or 3 applications top locally, because it's more convenient for me personally, not for necessarily for everybody. And then anything beyond that, I just want to know how I can connect to that something, right? We are already talking more about connections than running that something. Simply because beyond a couple of apps or microservices, whatever we call them today, the complexity of managing all at once increases drastically.
So that's completely local. Well, I guess it's across the board too. But once you get beyond whatever the number is for you, I mean, for some people, managing 3 may be too hard because they've been doing monoliths forever. Or they break it down to where their monolith turns into, it's like, oh, I'll just break these into 3, but now I'm going to do everything from a shared state perspective in the database. Well, again, effectively, you've just broken apart your monolith, but it's still a monolith, probably. In other words, you aren't using real service-to-service calls. But let's talk about the partially remote, where the code's on the machine. So I'm doing all my development locally, completely local, but everything's executed remotely. Now, we could get into the whole remote thing because even if you have something like Kind running locally on your machine, it's still remote because it's running in a VM, right? So we're talking about like really remote, like not on your machine at all. What does that look like? Is that just a namespace in Kubernetes or whatever the analog to that is in whatever environment you're using?
When you say namespace in Kubernetes, you mean for those others, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, you're not really concerned anymore about the namespace or even the cluster. You're more concerned about how you tell your application, the one that you're developing locally, the one you are actually focused on right now, how can that application connect with others, right? Because the default connection will not work because default connection will assume something that you don't have, right? That for you to have, you would probably need to run the whole system locally. So it's about figuring out how you tell where that dependency is to your application. And for that, you don't necessarily need to know the namespace or even the cluster or any of those things. You just need to know how to find it. And that's where we are probably entering into maybe the space of tools like Telepresence or Code Zero maybe, right? That can maybe, instead of you figuring out how to find the service or how to connect to the service somehow, you have some sort of tooling that would say, hey, redirect those requests. From the application perspective, you're still talking with something that is placed on the same cluster, right? But use this something that will actually forward those requests to production, maybe, or staging, right? So for you and for your application, you have the feeling that you're sitting right now in the same area where the rest of the system is, even though you're not.
What was the name of the tool? Because I'm trying to remember, there was something to where I could type locally, be completely local in my IDE, save it, but once I clicked on save, it actually made that change over in my, if it's Kubernetes based, it made the change in the cluster. What was that called?
Okay, that's different than what I thought, but I need to check my notes
before.
Just to remember what I talked about. My brain froze.
It's not like you haven't looked at 2,000 tools since then.
Yeah,
but there are tools, ignoring what the name is for a moment, there are tools that will allow you to do that. It's not, it basically completely abstracts away even the Heroku push type concept. You just save your file and it's automatically deployed and it's already magically working. Right? There is a tool that does that.
Yeah.
I know we've talked about it.
There are a bunch of them, right? But the question is whether that saves you from the potential connection issues, right? Because let's say that you have your personal space in a cluster where you can do stuff, right? And depending on the situation and what you're doing, you might still not run the whole system in your personal space. So you still need to figure out, okay, if I have in my personal namespace, somewhere, locally, remotely, doesn't matter, I have application A and B, and C and D and E are somewhere else. But A and B are going to, by default, assume that they are in that same space, right? Because in production, they're all together, those 5 of them. But when I work on it, I have only those 2 here, and the other 3 are somewhere else. So there is that thing, hey, I have my application I'm developing on either running locally or running remotely. And when it's running remotely, hopefully I'm synchronizing my local code with that something remote, or maybe deploying continuously, or maybe, anyways, it's getting somewhere wherever I want it to be somehow and continuously. But then, okay, and what do I do with the rest of the system? How do I tell that something where the rest of the system is? Especially since that rest of the system might not be even accessible by default from outside. Let's say that I'm developing a frontend, and that frontend is connected to a backend, and backend is running somewhere else. Backend is not exposed to ingress. It would be ridiculous for it to be exposed to, Or actually, backend of a frontend should be exposed through ingress because it's communicated through a browser. But let's say that code-dependent backend, right? So there are a bunch of applications that speak with each other that are not exposed outside of the space where they're running. And then that's where we are running into problems. Okay, how do we enable that communication? And how we do it safely? And how we do it in a way that doesn't really require additional work? And that's where I believe, and I think we haven't spoken about it much, right? But that's where Telepresence, Code Zero, and similar tools that basically start opening tunnels to other stuff come in.
Right. We do need to talk about that some more because it's interesting to see how those types of solutions now are starting to become critical for any kind of infrastructure work. I mean, used to be it was you would SSH into a bastion, and from the bastion you would go off and do your real work. That would get you in. But now that's not even good enough.
But even if that gets you in, right? Gets you in where? Right? Because there is a space where your application is living that you're developing right now. I'm using space instead of namespace because it can be anything, laptop, local Kubernetes, development server, development cluster. If that something is remote, then yes, you can tunnel it to SSH somehow and get there somehow, and it's painful and we hate it, but you get there somehow, and then you still have a question of, okay, I need to run the whole system. And the reason why I need to run the whole system is because from that place, I cannot access production or staging or whatever I need to access. So my dependencies are not reachable, therefore I need the whole system. But if you do make your dependencies reachable, then you can really focus, ideally, and I know that this is a huge security risk, ideally that reachiness or the way to reach dependencies would be just production.
So let's move on to the third one. So partially is doing all your development locally with an IDE on your machine. You're saving it and doing whatever it is to get your code to run somewhere else. So that's the partial. Let's talk about fully remote code. I'm going to read this specifically. IDE and compute is in a remote compute, or computer or compute. He has compute here. And I think there's two ways to think about this. It's the classical, sort of what we just thought about, SSH into a machine, and my IDE is Nano or Vim or Emacs, and I'm working on that machine. Or I'm doing a combination of something of GitHub Codespaces or Gitpod and whatever the backend or whatever the runtime is, right? I believe what he's asking there fits into that whole spectrum.
I must admit personally that I've been going back and forth on that one a lot. I had periods where I would do things fully remote, browser, something like GitHub, this and that, or Gitpod, or what's not. But I always end up going back to my not doing that. There is always some performance issue that I face. Like my shortcuts are not there. Alt-Tab is not getting me where I want it to be, and so on and so forth. So even though I promised many, many times that, okay, from now on I will be using this remote thingy, I never managed to stick with it. I never made it work for me.
What do you think that is?
I think simply that I'm less productive without, and I'm going to even mention a specific tool, without Visual Studio Code locally. I think it's all the shortcuts, and it is still not the same as browser. I guess it's the same reason why some people install email clients in their desktops. I don't do that, for example, right? I use Gmail in browser. But why, or people still use Office or, desktop version of Microsoft Word instead of Office 365. There is still something that makes an application in a browser less productive than that same application as a desktop app. And I think that applies, that is not specific to, hey, we do whole development remotely, 100%, but basically to anything else. Like Slack. Which Slack are you using, Darin? Is it desktop or...
Exactly. I don't use the browser. Yeah.
I mean, theoretically, you could. It would be more convenient. You would have less thing to install, but you're still using the desktop version because we are not there yet, generally speaking, I think, using browser as replacement for desktop.
Which is funny because when you look at any of the Electron-based apps, such as Slack, such as VS Code, it seems like, okay, we'll just use it in the browser. But I think we've been mentally conditioned that a browser is for browsing or email or anything else but doing real work. Do you think that's it? Part of it is at least mentally that?
Yeah, and it's also switching between tabs and switching between applications is not the same thing. It's simply not there yet.
It's that muscle memory, right? You've called it out. Alt-Tab didn't work for you, right? So you've got the muscle memory to Alt-Tab between different applications.
And I cannot change that muscle memory because we would need to reach the point probably where everything is browser-based for me to change that muscle memory, right? If I have something browser-based, something desktop-based, and there is no tangible advantage of browser-based except being a browser, then my muscle memory is going to stay with desktop.
Right. Now, this is interesting. Very recently, Gitpod did announce VS Code desktop support. So you can access your Gitpod workspaces, and I'm reading this from their changelog. You can access Gitpod workspaces right from your locally installed VS Code. We call it VS Code desktop support. So that way you can keep your local settings, and there's a caveat there. I'm not going to read it. And benefit from Gitpod's high-spec servers and automated pre-builds.
That's
interesting, right? That's interesting.
Exactly. That's what makes all the other tools that basically synchronize. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that there are things I still prefer locally, and there are things I still prefer remotely. And what we're really looking into are not necessarily the tools that will replace one with the other, that will make me fully local, fully remote, but the tooling that synchronizes those two locations or enables communication between those two locations. Let's say that you could phrase it as saying, we need tooling that will make heterogeneous, is that a word? Heterogeneous.
Yes, it is.
Hybrid, there we go. Hybrid setup works seamlessly. That's what we truly need. And especially if you stop even looking at development is isolation, right? We are ultimately talking about different compute, different servers, different clusters, different networking, and a bunch of other things involved in a life cycle of an application, right? I'm switching now from development to life cycle just to kind of like increase the scope. So there are many things involved, and the real question, and it's almost certain that it will not stop being hybrid anytime soon. Maybe one part of that story, yes, but the story itself is going to continue being hybrid. If anything, it is going to become even more hybrid. So it's really about tooling that make those differences disappear or become transparent. Okay, so you want to code locally, excellent. You want it to run that code remotely, excellent. And you're not going to have any additional work to make that happen, right? That's going to be flawless for you. That's when we're talking about the real deal, I think.
So we've talked local, we've talked partial, we've talked fully. What else is there? You actually brought it up, hybrid. Right?
It would be kind of partial, right?
That is, well, it is. I guess it is. That is partial based on what he just said. It seems like partial is actually the better solution.
Yes.
Because I could always work in a partial environment. It may not be the optimal, ignoring that I just read the Gitpod changelog. But again, that's newish. Prior to that, we really didn't have a good, clean way of doing it.
We're getting there, I think. Like you just read one of the news, right? There are many others, but I think that it is generally important to understand that we as industry, we are not going back to where we were 30 years ago, where you have one place, one solution, one everything, That's not going to happen, right? Never again, most likely, unless we get another big company that dominates everything. So it's really about bridging the gap about whatever hybrid means in your case. And I'm really using loose term like hybrid can be even kind on your local machine plus code directly on your file system, right? In a way that is hybrid. That's a combination of different things.
No, it's interesting that you brought up there's no longer going to be one. So I think about the one being Eclipse. I think about JetBrains, any of their IDEs. The good thing about that is that you had a consistent way of things being configured on a developer's machine. At least in theory, you did. Realistically, it never was. There was always something that was busted with any of the IDEs. The thing I like about the code spaces and the Gitpods is if I needed to bring on a developer to a project, they've got a workspace, it's already pre-configured. They're going to be, other than understanding the business part of it, if they already know the development language, they're going to be hyper productive near day one versus jacking around with getting the runtimes right on their machines or getting the pathing correct and all the other craziness that it comes when you're first bootstrapping locally. To me, that's the greatest benefit in any of the fully remote IDEs. Not so much as the remote IDE, because I could say a remote IDE is VI or Emacs on a distance Linux box. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Gitpods and the code spaces of the world. So it just depends. Plus, do you have good internet or not? Right? That's a big question.
Yeah. But that's not a strategic question. That's a big question for today, but we know that most likely the coverage is only going to increase of internet. So we can probably exclude that as something that we as industry should be thinking about from the perspective of the roadmap. Hey, let's make this better for people with bad internet connection because within 5 years, by the time we are finished, there will be less of them.
Well, Starlink will be fully GA in 5 years. And yes, it will be more expensive probably than a typical broadband to a house, but it's still going to be pretty darn good.
And it's not going to be the only one, most likely. Whenever somebody figures something out, others are coming in and they will drop the prices and all that jazz. But going back to what you said about JetBrains, right? You said JetBrains is kind of, if I understood right, the one that gives you what you need. In my head, it's not. And it never tried to be, because when I think about those things, I try to think about them as a life cycle of something, right? JetBrains never tried to provide everything you need to deliver your applications all the way until it's in production, right? Maybe they are, if you include TeamCity there, though.
Yeah, but I was thinking more along the lines of I was comparing just the IDE part of it, like Eclipse. And
oh yeah.
I said JetBrains because they've got so many different specific. I didn't want to just call out IntelliJ specifically because they have many others that are good. Bottom line is today, would you agree? All right, so since we're talking IDEs for a moment, what do you think the top IDEs are today, paid or unpaid?
VS Code and variations of it, all the variations. Yeah, I mean, when I say VS Code, I include Gitpod in it, right? And I think GitHub also is based on
GitHub Code Spaces is based on it, yeah. So I think if you're not using VS Code today, you need to at least look at it. It could probably cover a lot of things. I have to admit, though, there's still a lot of things inside of IntelliJ, specifically for Java developers, if you're doing Java development, and their Golang IDE is really good as well, that I have not seen VS Code be able to get to certain things that are really nice within those specific IDEs.
I think that the major difference is that the roles changed. When a while ago, when I was working in IntelliJ, in my head, I had to justify why would I switch to VS Code, because I'm used to IntelliJ, I know it well, so I'm not going to switch to VS Code only because there is that tiny difference. Kind of it had to be a significant improvement for me to switch from one or the other. Now it's the other way around. Since VS Code is everywhere, then you need a justification why not to switch to it in a way, right? Because it's literally everywhere. It would be the same thing like Today you need to have a very, very good reason why you're not using Kubernetes, why you're using Swarm or Nomad or Mesos, right? And in the past, it was the other way around. Kind of, hey, if you're not using Mesos, you need to have a very good reason. Very, very good reason not to use it, right? And that's all about the centers of gravity, right? Our industry tends to gravitate towards one type of solution or the other, and then all the vendors or the other solutions are built on top of it. And right now, VS Code has that ecosystem that makes it the potentially best solution, right? Again, not because how good or bad VS Code is, but because it's everywhere.
Are you actually saying something nice about Microsoft at this point?
Oh, well, I think that Microsoft did great with VS Code. I think it did great with GitHub, with many other things. I mean, I was about to say Azure, but okay, that would be a separate subject. So Microsoft did a lot of great things. I think that they were unfortunate to be that they're still judged by their past history, and they're not perfect. But kind of people would automatically put Microsoft and Google in very different categories, and I think that that's more because of history than what they're doing.
Stefan, hopefully we answered some of your questions here. And if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, well, actually, I have even a better way of dealing with partial or full or even local. Your answer for local is, well, I've got a 40-core, 1 terabyte machine sitting under my desk. We'd like to hear from you too. So over in the podcast channel of the Slack workspace, go and comment on this episode. We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.